Hopefully you have 3 brushes. I've got a big, medium, and small brush. I got the big 1-inch, the medium 1/2-inch flat brushes, and the small round brush. Hopefully you have that. And then I've got a canvas. This one's a 16 by 20. And I just put that horizontal. And I've got 2 water jars. I just use 2 so that I don't have to continually keep refilling them. If you only have 1, that's fine too. And then I've got paper towels or an old t-shirt to blot your brushes on. So hopefully you have that around. And I also have paint. I'm using acrylic paint here today, and I've got white, mostly white, blue, red, and green. I did put 2 different color blues on here because I had them in my set, and I did 2 different color greens, so one's lighter than the other. So if you have a bigger variety of paint, you can use a lighter blue and a darker blue and a lighter green and a darker green. But if you don't have that, we can also just mix a little bit of color to compensate for that. So don't worry if you don't have more than just the basics. So, oh, and I also have, you gotta have your fun drink.
Excellent. The essential part of it. That one looks awfully clear. So either you're mainlining vodka or you're just
yeah. I must admit, I'm kind of a health nut. So I was listening to a nutrition thing earlier, and it guilted me about my alcohol consumption. So
yes, your outrageous alcohol.
Well, my once a week sipping and painting alcohol consumption. So I'm trying to be healthy in these times.
I like
it. Have water, but I put it in a goblet, so it looks festive.
Yes, there you go. A little fun.
Honestly, usually I drink those little hard ciders or the sparkling, but they kind of make you burpy, and it's not good when you teach. So we don't want that. But let's see. So to get started with this, I'm gonna. Oh, and my assistant is Sabrina here today, and so if you have any questions, you can either ask us over the chat or just ask us because it's just us tonight. So either way. But I have my big brush, and I'm going to get started painting this mountain splendor painting background to foreground. And I do have my little sample over here, but there's a screen up that you can access. If you make that the big screen, you can access that as the sample on the Zoom as well. So I am going to start with the background of this painting, and that's with the big brush. And I'm going to dip that big brush in the water jar to get it wet, and then blot it on the paper or the paper towel or the t-shirt. And I'm going to start by dipping the big brush in the white paint. And in this case, the sky is actually a phthalo blue. So if you have that in your set, in my set, it's the darker of the 2 blues. It's just to make a different contrasting blue for the sky behind the mountains. If you don't have 2 different color blues, you can add just a touch of green in with your blue paint, and it'll give that sky, we kind of want a little bit of teal color for the sky. That's why we don't want it to look green. We just want to add more of a teal or turquoise color for the sky blue. So it's mostly white with the big brush, and then just a corner of the brush, dipping that in the darker of the 2 blue paints and mixing that around. And you can mix it around on the plate. Make sure you get the color you want, because we want this to be pretty light going on. We want it to be, if you think of value as a scale from light to dark, we want this to be almost on the white side of the scale, very light. And I'm starting at the top of the canvas, and I'm going to go about halfway down the canvas with that blue. Since acrylic is layered, we want to add water to the paint. So I did dip the big brush back into the water jar as I'm painting. And that thins out the paint, because believe it or not, with more water in the paint, it actually will dry a little bit faster. It kind of sounds counterintuitive, but that is the truth. And we want it to dry pretty quick for us, because we're going to do this painting in a short period of time. So I'm starting at the top, and I'm going to go about halfway down. And it doesn't really matter how those brush strokes go on to start. I just want them to reach halfway down the canvas. We are going to layer the mountains in front of the sky, but we want to make sure our whole sky, or our sky, goes beneath the horizon line of the mountains. So we want to make sure you go at least halfway down so that you don't get blank spaces where the valleys of the mountains come together. And I am just adding a little bit of that turquoisey blue. If you don't have turquoise, again, you can just add a little bit of green paint, just a tiny bit, and mix that up on your plate. I am using a paper plate as a palette today. Oh, and by the way, I hope you had a apron or something to cover your clothing with, because acrylic can be messy and we don't want to get it on our clothes. So hopefully you have, I always forget to say that because I'm always wearing my apron, but you want to make sure you have that.
Yep.
All right, and that is what that looks like with this turquoise paint. Really light. It's mostly white, really, and just a touch of color in there, about halfway down the canvas.
Okay. I feel like mine's maybe a little darker, but.
And that's okay too. I mean, this goes on a little bit bolder. I always start with less paint. I might kind of go on the theory that less is better, because if I want to darken it up, I can add more later. Usually when you look up in the sky, it's darkest at the top, so you could also make it a little bit darker towards the top edge of the canvas, and then make it a little bit more white as you go down towards the middle of the canvas. So that's another option. I'll add a little more dark up there so you can see what I'm talking about with that. Kind of get a blend going because my paint's already wet. And I did also go all the way around. If you have a canvas that wraps over the stretcher bars, you want to make sure you get those edges that wrap around. Get these, because then you won't need a frame for it when you go hang it up. You can just hang it up frameless if it's nice and painted all the way around those edges. I'm going to make sure I get all of those in there. So that's what it looks like with a little more of the dark blue right along the top edge. And I added a little more. I added a little more dark blue at the top there, and my paint was already wet, so it was able to be blended in there. So if we want to blend paint, we just kind of do wet and wet, and that's how I got that kind of ombre look. If you allow the paint to dry, then you need to wet it again in order to blend. I'm just finishing those edges up. I haven't painted this painting in a while. It's a nice one.
Learn how to paint for a while, and classes always seem like such a big commitment, but this is such a delightful little, you know, I can still hang out with the family and learn some stuff along the way, which is just very cool.
That's right. It's kind of a different vibe. It's not as noisy. It's kind of
just
like
not as adult, right? Like,
yeah. I'm like Bob Ross, but much more hyper than he is.
excellent. We'll take it. All right, we are ready.
All right, so I need to let this dry for just a minute. And normally, you know, normally I would, if I was at the studio, play some music, you go to the bar, drink your drink, but I let that dry for just a couple minutes. But right now I can let you know, I'm supposed to let you know about some things we got going on in the studio. I don't know if you know, we have kits for sale for both grown-ups and kids. So you can always stop by, get one of those, or you can, and when you stop by, bring your finished painting to show Nancy. She always loves to see the finished ones. And then we also have masks for sale, which are cool. They're branded. So they're really cute. They got little sipping and painting masks. So you can pick up one of those. And we also have little kind of impressionistic ones too. So we have those things for sale at the studio, and then also the original paintings that we make on the videos go up for sale at the studio. So we drop those off, and then you can own an original for a bargain, or get one for a friend. So you can take a look at those if you're around here. But now that I have my sky there, we can add a little bit of clouds in our sky. And clouds, you can kind of go out with that. I'm going to leave behind that big brush. And you can, I'm going to get out that medium-sized brush for my clouds. And I always recommend, here's where, again, less is better. I'm going to dip that medium-sized brush into the water jar. And I want to mix the wet, whoops. I want to mix the wet brush into that white paint because I just want it to be watered down white, kind of the consistency of skim milk, because we want to make clouds that are very misty looking. So once I have that watered down white on that medium sized brush, I'm going to use little spiral shaped brush strokes and start some small clouds in the sky. And luckily, actually, the blue behind it is still wet, and that is working to my advantage because it actually just blends right into that sky. But if there gets to be too much blue on the brush, if the paint underneath is wet, I'm using the medium-sized brush for this. Just make sure you clean off the brush in order to get white paint back on it. And so when I clean it off, I make sure to blot it on the paper towel. And when I blot it on the paper towel, I actually lay it all the way down flat so that I get the water off of the handle as well as just the bristles, because you want to make sure it doesn't drip down into your work. So picking up the watered down white paint again, I'm going to use spiral shaped brush strokes and just make little puffy clouds. And I always sort of think of them as being kind of triangular shapes, so they're higher in the middle, but that's kind of a formulaic way of making clouds. There's kind of no right or wrong with clouds because they can be any shape. That's my go-to default because it kind of makes them look like those little storm clouds in the summer, I figure. Kind of higher in the middle, but it's up to you. You play around with it and make different shaped clouds depending on what you see out your window or your imagination.
Wow,
And I always
really are like.
Yeah. I always start with less paint. You can always add more white. So right now you can see there's very little white on there. It's blending in with the blue of the sky that was wet underneath, but just a little bit of white paint and kind of makes them look see-through and misty and light and airy, which is our goal. And you can go wild with those clouds. Add as many as you want. Make them overlapping or make them go right off the edge of the canvas. Kind of have fun with your clouds. And for extra realism bonus points, this is also an option. You can take the blue that you used from the sky and add a touch of that on the underneath side of the cloud to make it appear shadowed. You know how in the summer sky, sometimes you'll see they'll look kind of gray on the bottom or darker on the bottom. If you add the blue that you used from the sky color to that bottom, you get this effect where it's a little darker, and then it gives it a sort of three-dimensional quality.
Cohesiveness.
So yeah, that's something you can experiment with also. Not totally necessary, but that can be fun and interesting. So you can experiment with that and see if you like it. I keep dipping the medium-sized brush in the water and blotting it on the paper towel, and then I'm using just a wet brush to blend those colors together that I already have on there. I use very little color when I'm making these clouds, just a little bit, getting just the tips of the bristles with paint on them and using that very little bit to make these clouds. I think less is better. Sometimes if you use too much paint, they get to look a little bit like cotton balls.
I do like your cotton balls, but you said
Well, and that could work too. You know.
you like your cotton balls. I think they're just fine. If you want to keep going with them, I think that's great.
See right there, I added a lot of dark paint. So I just wet the brush off and now it's totally clean, but just has water on it. And I'm gonna just use the water to spread that out. And then it'll correct that sort of initial putting on too much color. I'll just spread that out, put it on my other cloud. When I paint, I kind of always think of it as you're constantly correcting what you're working on. Put a little paint on there. If it looks too dark, make it lighter. If it looks too light, make it darker. It's always a constant back and forth correcting.
Constant battle.
And I'm using mostly spiral shaped brush strokes or little U shapes. Keep that puffy cloud texture. Oop. That was a mistake. I think I just dipped in the wrong color. So you can also use a clean brush to just erase. And I just took a wet brush, touched that color I put on there mistakenly, and now I'm just wiping it on the paper towel. So that's another option. Always fixable acrylic. That's why it's so nice to work with. Now I can go over it with the white. Ah, that's much better. And I'm adding a little bit of white. I'm looking at the ones I've just painted as they dry, and I'm adding just a little bit of white here and there, mostly in the middles of the clouds to give them kind of weight or dimension, kind of towards the centers of those clouds. So it's more white in the middle, or the middles or the tops, because you want maybe to give an impression that there's light bouncing off the tops there, or more water vapor in the middle. So just adding just a touch more white to the middles, but we want them to fade off on the edges.
So I'm getting streakies
What's that?
across my getting too much water I added. Like if water's dripping down, that's too much, right?
Oh yeah, we don't want it so drippy that we get little drips down. You can real quick use your paper towel to blot if you get drips. That's my go-to. And then you can smooth out the sky beneath. And don't worry too much about that. If you get too much drips down there, remember we're going to put the mountains in front of that sky. So some of that will be obscured by the mountains that we're going to paint next.
Gotcha.
Keep picking up that dark blue. You need to get more white. There you go. Puffy little clouds. It's a constant cleaning the brush and wiping it on the paper towel to get it clean, just to keep very little paint on there. Yeah, and I'm always wiping on the paper towel to get the excess water because we don't want it too drippy. We just want a damp brush.
What are you making over there?
Get some of my clouds overlapping. I'm gonna make one more cloud on mine on the right-hand side here. Right now I have like 5 clouds kind of evenly distributed up here, but I wanna make a little bit more, I don't know, I wanna make one more here on the right so it's a little bit off center, a little bit uneven. I always think that's more appealing in painting if you make things a little bit uneven. Makes it more interesting to the eye. And I'm going to make this last one that's lower right, the biggest one as well. So my biggest cloud, lower right, going right off that right-hand edge. Cleaning off the brush and using just the damp brush to blend my darker underneath blue into my white on the top of the cloud, and then going back with a little bit more white just in the middle with those little upside down U-shaped brush strokes. And going over some of my previous clouds, it keeps, the white tends to dry a little bit clear on my set here. So I keep adding a little bit more white, plain white, to those. Because we don't want the clouds to disappear. We do want them to be showy. But that's why we start with less. Less is better, and then we can always add more. There we go. Let me hold that up so you can see it. We've got upside down U shapes there on those white puffs, and U-shaped bottoms, little scallop bottoms, I should say, with the blue that I used from the sky. So I'd say that the blue underneath the clouds is about the same blue as the top edge of the canvas, like about that dark. That kind of mid-value teal blue. Let that dry. Actually, that one, that last cloud has a little funky bottom there. I'm gonna smooth that out a little bit. It's pokey. Now I'm using just a damp brush to blend those together because my paint is mostly dry at this point. So just using a damp brush that's cleaned off in the water jar and wiped on the paper towel, that allows me to just blend what I have there all together. So I was just making a nice transition between the white and the blue in the clouds. That's fun, but I should probably be done with those. Let me take a sip of my drink. We do have live classes going on at Sipping and Painting Hampton right now. We do have small classes to keep everybody safe. They're all distance the tables from one another, and everybody's wearing masks. And it's been fun little crowds. So if you want to see what's coming up, look on our online schedule, and you can see we're doing both Zoom classes and live classes. So that is what is going on at the shop. And then we also have daytime hours if you want to come in and just get a kit or a mask as well.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. So now we have little puffy clouds in our happy little sky, and I want to put in the mountain foreground or middle ground, I guess, in this painting. So we have this mountain splendor, and you can see these clouds or these mountains are really tall, pointy. They kind of remind me of the Himalayas because they're really tall, pointy, triangular mountains. They're very not much of a peak there if you were to climb up those mountains. If you want to make them look more like a Colorado landscape, then I'd recommend making them a little bit lower profile triangle and maybe more rounded out. If you actually think about looking up at Mount Evans, it's not pointy at the top. It's actually triangular in shape in that it slopes on the sides, but it's more rounded out at that very top. So it's kind of up to you. I am sort of obligated to be making a copy of my sample. So I'm going to stick with the more Himalaya look of these, but it's up to you if you want to make them more of a Colorado landscape. So I am going to use my big brush for this, and it is, oh, and by the way, I always leave my other brushes sitting in the water jar while I'm painting. We don't want the brushes to dry out because we want to be able to clean them later. And since acrylic is a kind of a plastic, it'll dry solid on those brushes if you let it. So I always leave them in the water jar while I'm painting, and then at the end of the evening, I can clean off those brushes while they're still wet. So I'm going to use my big brush, and I did wipe that on the paper towel, and I'm going to pick up white paint. My plate, since I tipped it up, it got kind of messy. I might have to get myself more white. I think it's mixing with the other colors. But I'm going to just load the tips of the bristles of the big brush up with white paint, and there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 peaks on this canvas. So you can go up and down. Make sure you make some taller and some shorter. And in this painting, the tallest one's right in the middle, but it's up to you which way you want to go with that. But do make sure that the valleys do not go beneath your sky, because we want to make sure that there's blue sky behind those mountains. So just using the white paint, I'm just going to go up and down and get those mountain peaks started. And I am going to go with the, whoop, see, my white is all mixed in with my blue on my plate. I'm going to have to get some fresh white here because it keeps messing me up. There we go. I picked up blue, which we are going to get to, not a big mistake, but we do want to start this with white. And I always make them kind of bumpy also. So it's good if your hand shakes a little bit, that comes in handy here because you want to make them rocky mountains. So the edges of them aren't straight lines. They're bumpy, wavy lines.
You're not using like the edge of your brush, you're using the full-on brush to make the...
Well, yeah, I started with the big 1 inch. It's totally up to you. You can even use a small brush just to make this horizon line if you are very particular about the shapes of those mountains. But I just feel like there's a lot of canvas real estate I've got to fill up here. So I'm using the big brush so that I can fill all of that beneath that horizon line with white. We just want to make sure we get an edge we're happy with. That's why you can use a smaller brush if you feel like that gives you more hand control. That is perfectly good. Right now I'm just starting these with white, and I'm even overlapping some of my clouds there. And I made 5 peaks going across, some shorter than others. And right now I just went beneath the top edge of the mountain line that I made, and I covered wherever there was sky there with the white paint. So let me hold that up so you can see it. Just basically a silhouette of white mountains at this point. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across. And the middle one in this one is the tallest, but that is totally up to you as the artist. Make yours unique. And I space these pretty evenly. You can actually, I think I'll close up one of those valleys so that they're a little closer together too. One of them. Because they don't have to be all evenly spaced. We don't want to make it look like Charlie Brown's shirt, you know?
Yeah.
Let's forget what those, is that chevrons, the little peaks?
The little up and downs, yep.
Yeah.
And are you filling in your whole mountain so that they're all white now?
Yeah, so I'm starting with all white, and then we'll add some shading to our mountains. I just wanted to make sure I used all white to cover up any sky that I had painted beneath. And then we can get that shading on one side or another. All right. And that is how that looks closer up.
All right.
And now I can add a little bit of shading. Now, on my sample painting, all the shading is on the right-hand side. So I guess that would indicate the sun is on the left-hand side. It's kind of up to you. With these clouds, it just looks like light sources from above. I wasn't very careful with my light source. If you made it on one side or another, you can shift the shading over to the other side. It's totally fine to add it to the right side if you prefer. But I'm going to stick with my sample. And I did have 2 different blues in my set. So if you have, I used a more turquoise or phthalo blue for the sky, and now I'm going to switch to the ultramarine blue for the mountains. But if you don't have that, you could just use a darker blue for the shading, darker than what is in your sky. And it's up to you. You can switch to the medium-sized brush if that is a little bit easier, give you a little more hand control. But when I do shading, I always think of standing on the mountain peak and skiing down kind of left and right on that fall line.
Okay.
You know how you ski in kind of like an S-shaped pattern back and forth? And then I paint everything to one side of that line darker blue.
So both of the blues that I haven't put black in them. Is that?
Yeah, you could add a little bit of black to make that a darker blue. Oh, Sibri, do you want to fix the focus on that? There we go. We got tricks. There we go. Yeah, you can always make a little bit darker blue by adding some black into that, mixing it up on the plate, or using just a different shade. But I started at the very peak of the mountain and then went kind of S-shaped back and forth and off to the right, kind of skiing off to the right-hand side of the mountain, and then everything to the right of that line, painting in a darker blue. And you don't have to paint it in neatly. I've got that white underneath, and it's mixing with that, and it's giving me a lot of texture. It doesn't have to be an even shade or tone. It's like I can leave it some light, some dark. It'll make it look like I have texture in that snow on the mountain. So I think that's nice.
So you have lots of white on there.
Yeah. And I'm going to do that with each one of these mountains. And you can see on this sample, sometimes the shading reaches a little bit more off to the left-hand side of the slope, and sometimes it stays more to the right. So you can kind of go back and forth with your skiing action. When you put that line in there, you can go really wild. I'll make this one really exaggerated so you can see what I mean. The one consistent thing is I just paint the right-hand side of that line in. Doesn't matter where the line is exactly, just painting the whole right-hand side. And I do go right up to the edge of the top of the mountain with that. Because I want to make sure my shading goes all the way to the mountaintop. And I can even adjust that bumpy edge too. Sometimes I pick up a little bit more dark blue and add some darker blue shadows in there. And I'm just letting them kind of trickle down and fade away into points at the bottom there. You do want to make sure you go down about 2/3 of the way down your canvas, or I mean, you can even go down 3/4. It kind of, you could go all the way to the bottom. It doesn't really matter because we're going to end up layering over the grassy meadow in front. You just want to make sure you make it at least 2/3 of the way down. So like the sky, you don't get a gap between mountain and meadow.
And it goes all the way to the edge.
My right-hand mountain, yeah, my shading is going to go all the way around the edge. And I do actually go all the way around the edge of the canvas. I'll show you what that looks like. I go all the way around that right-hand edge.
Oh, okay.
Furthest right mountain. And I kind of skipped around. I didn't do this third one and the one on the left too. Now this third one over here, I just have it ending in a triangle, and I'm going to leave that far right one overlapping. It's okay if you didn't do it that way. You can also let that dry and then come back with white and go over that if you prefer that look later. You can always readjust it.
I like this whole fixing thing.
That is the great part
pretty
about
cool.
with acrylic. Since it is layered, you can always change it and adjust it. The one sort of limitation to that is you kind of do need to be happy with the layers as you make them. So you can fix the layer you're working on, but once that's done, that's kind of done. So I guess you can fix, but kind of one layer at a time. We do teach the Bob Ross classes at the studio. Nancy does those because she's the certified Bob Ross instructor. And what's interesting about his technique is that he worked wet in wet paint, because oil paints take about a month to cure. And so it's a very different technique. You can make changes to it, but it's different. And he perfected a technique that used the paint very thinly as he applied it. So that's kind of what's so magical about it. But you should take one of those classes. You can learn the different medium and see how wonderful oil can be too. I'm just roughing up my texture here. I'm going back over some of the shaded parts that I made, and I'm making short little brush strokes with that medium-sized brush to kind of make some of that darker blue and some lighter blue, just giving the mountains a kind of bumpy texture using light and dark on my shading. And I'm just doing that on the shady sides, and I'm leaving the white sides totally white. If you want, on this sample, there's a little bit of light blue to add texture as well. So you can do that. Just make sure you clean off the brush because you want it to be very light blue on the sunny side of the mountain. So that would be using mostly white paint on a clean brush and just a little touch of the blue if you want to add a little bit of texture on that side as well. And you can kind of make short little brush strokes or little, I don't know, I'm kind of zigzagging back and forth with my brush. Kind of a combination.
All right, these feel like clouds again. What am I missing here? I don't know if you can.
Well, I'm just doing the mountain sides at this point. I've left my clouds behind.
Yeah, I feel like my darker sections are starting to look very cloud-like.
Are they taken over? You can also add white over those edges to blend those out if they're kind of looking hard-edged. So I cleaned off that medium-sized brush, and now I'm going over some of those edges with white, and I'm kind of scrubbing the brush around well, scrubbing the brush around, I guess, is the best way to put that. Or you can do that with either just a wet brush if the paint's still wet, or put a little bit of white paint on that brush if you want to blend those darker areas into the white. That's an option too. And then you wouldn't get as hard edge look. That's how that would look. Because some of those edges, I left some of the edges more hard, but some of them fade into white. And that really gives it more of a snowy texture on those mountains, I guess. Just using a wet brush, I can get that effect going. Because my paint is still a little bit wet.
And I want to make sure that there's not really any white on the edge, on the shady edge, right?
It's okay if there's white on the right-hand side. It's darker and lighter here and there. Because sometimes if you have a little white on the shady side, it'll just make it look like the sun is glinting off a rock.
Okay.
That's okay too. I would say I'm using mostly medium to dark value on the right-hand sides though. Yeah, I'm working that all the way up to the edge. One thing I'm looking for also is I don't want the brush stroke or the lines on the painting to look like the texture of the brush. So I'm twisting the brush around in my hand in different directions to kind of make those little brush strokes different as they hit the canvas, so that they don't look like any kind of pattern that I'm getting off the brush. That's why I kind of scrub it around and twist it around. And I just want to make a lot of variety and give that texture that makes the mountain look rocky. I don't want it to look like brushstrokey. But I'm going to call that good. I do have the paint going low enough, the shading going low enough that it's going to be beneath my meadow's edge here. So I want to make sure I go at least 2/3 the way down the canvas before I let it fade away. So I'm just using a damp brush to pull some of that shading down here so that I don't get any gaps. And that goes for the white or the light sides of the mountains too. Just pulling some of that down a little bit further. Because we are going to layer in our little meadow next. Ah, I like that. I love mountains. That's why I love living here. Although, since this is going up on our YouTube channel, maybe you live someplace where you don't get to see mountains, and this is your big chance to think about them and paint them. That's nice too. If you are joining us later on the YouTube channel, do make sure you subscribe to our channel and like this video, because that'll help us move up the little metrics in YouTube, and we'll be able to bring you more videos. And this is my Venmo. If you want to hit up the virtual tip jar, that's at Ehrnstein Arts, and I think that's up on another one of the windows in our little Zoom chat here. So you can drop a tip in the virtual tip jar, is always appreciated. I was watching YouTube earlier today. So much good content, people teaching you all their secrets. All right, so once you have the mountains there, I just swish that medium-sized brush around in the water jar, and I'm going to leave it so that it doesn't dry out. And then I can get my big brush back. And here, again, I pick up the big brush because I'm going to be covering a lot of canvas. So I want to do that fairly quickly with my big brush, and that is cleaned off in the water jar and wiped on the paper towel. And again, I wipe that, I have an old t-shirt here, I wipe that sideways with the handle touching the paper towel so I get the water off the handle as well. And I do have 2 different color greens in this set. If you don't have 2 different color greens, you'll want to use a lighter green for the meadow color, because we're going to have darker trees in the foreground. So if you don't have a lighter green, then add more white to your green paint, and maybe even a touch of yellow, because this is kind of a warm, we want to make it look like a sun-dappled meadow. So it's kind of a warm color. So I'm going to use a big brush and white paint. And if I was to mix that, I would add a little bit of yellow paint next, and then the green, and mix that all together on your mixing plate before you apply it to the canvas. I also do tend to mix on the canvas as I paint, so it doesn't have to be all perfectly mixed on your mixing plate before you apply it, but you can do that as you do make that paint up. So using that big brush and some lighter color, you can start by going either straight across or making a bumpy, in the case of this sample, we got a bumpy hill shaped meadow covering the lower third of our canvas. And you can just make that sort of an upside down U shape or a gentle wavy horizon line. And it doesn't have to be straight across. You could make it go up, down, tilted. It's up to you. Make that a little interesting. I think I'll make mine a little bit higher on the right, just to give that a little bit of interest. And kind of make that a wavy line as I go. And here again, not all mixed on the plate. Some of it's lighter, some of it's darker, but I just want to fill in that whole horizon line and down to the bottom with green, my lighter color green. And you can also add a little bit of water to the paint to stretch that out and thin down the paint. And it's okay if it's drippy because we're going all the way down to the bottom edge with this color. So I added, with my big brush, white paint and light green and made a wavy horizon line overlapping in front of my mountains all the way down to the bottom edge of that canvas. And I'm going around the edges as well, where the canvas wraps the stretcher bars. And right now I'm using a back and forth brush stroke just to fill in that space. Once I get the paint on there, I can smooth out, make longer brush strokes if I want it really smooth, or make short little brush strokes to give it texture. And that's where you can experiment and use maybe up and down or scrubby brush strokes and see what textures you get out of that brush and what you like. Depends on your personal style. Maybe some people like it more smooth and you want to go all the way across with big, long brush strokes, give you a little arm exercise going all the way across that canvas. Or else maybe you like a lot of texture and you want to use short stipple brush strokes, short stutter brush strokes. That's where you get to experiment and see what you like best and what is your personal style. We love creativity at the Sip and Paint. And we always have a sample that we're working from. This one is by my coworker Vanessa. And even though we're painting from a common sample, you will find that no two paintings ever look alike, and that is the beauty of painting. So like here, I'm adding a little bit darker green in with my paint that was already there, and that'll make it interesting. So it doesn't all have to be the same shade. And if I add a little bit of wavy line beneath my horizon line, it'll make it look like I have hills overlapping too. Let me hold that up so you can see that. So I started out with darker top edge, then faded to white or lighter green. And then I added a little bit darker green edge beneath that and a wavy line in front. So it looks like there's a lower hill overlapping my background horizon line. And right here, like here's an example of, this is what I'm looking for. I have a funny little brush stroke that's visible there. So that would be something I'd want to smooth out. That's where I clean the brush off by swishing it around really well in the water jar, blot it on a paper towel so it's just damp, and then I can go over that line and smooth it out. And then you see it disappears when I just go over that with a damp brush. You want to do that before the paint is dry. Acrylic paint kind of behaves funny sometimes. If it's half dry and you overwork it, sometimes you get some strange patterns out of it. So you kind of gotta work it while it's pretty wet, or else let it dry totally and then you can go over it with a second layer. But when it's half dry, that's when it gets kind of strange. And then you pick up these brush strokes. Sometimes brush strokes are a good thing because they show texture, but sometimes they're so obvious that we want to smooth them out. Or rough them up with shorter, more scratchy hand motions. And if you twist the brush in your hand and twist your hand around, you get different directions. That's what gives that variety. Let's hold that up now. You can see that real rough texture in there. That's from all that twisting the wrist around. And that's my lighter color meadow. And now we have a bunch of happy like flowers. It looks like there's a bunch of blossoms on that hillside. And in my sample here, they're kind of, they almost look like bouquets or bushes of, I don't know enough about flowers, but they look like little oh, I want to say just puffy little blossoms of flowers. I don't know. But you don't have to do them in groups like that. You can use dots to indicate distant little speckles of flowers too. I have not been hiking in way too long, so I can't think of what all the varieties we have. I always think there's like Indian paintbrush, I think is the big one you see in Colorado Mountains, and columbines. And they're red ones and blue ones. You can have fun with these. On this plate, I have red and yellow, and that's the kind of little dappled flowers I'm going to add in there. There's two options for doing that. Let me say, with the yellow paint in the acrylic, and actually it depends on your acrylic paint, but I found that the paint itself is a little bit thin. So we paint in layers, but sometimes the paint is so thin as it comes out of the package that it's very see-through or translucent. So to get it to be more less see-through and more opaque, we add a little bit of white in with the paint, and that acts as a primer and helps us cover the layers that we've got on the painting. So I'm going to add a little bit of white paint mixed with my yellow, and I'm switching to a little skinny brush for this to show you. I wet my little skinny brush in the water jar, wiping it on the paper towel and mixing it with white, little white and yellow together, because that'll make that yellow cover better. And just spinning that around on my mixing plate to get that mixed up together. And you can use the tip of the brush to just dot little dots on there. You can also use the handle side of the brush. We do this more when we do starry landscapes, but if you use the handle side and dip that in the paint, you'll get little dots as well. So it's kind of an either or technique. If you don't like the, it depends on how light your touch is. Sometimes it's nice to use the handle because you'll get nice little round dots. But if you use the tips of the bristles, if you press a little bit hard, you'll get flattened out brush strokes. But if you have a real light touch, you could get dots as well. I'm just tapping on those yellow dots real lightly, and I just started with my foreground hill. You can make some in the background. You can make the distant flowers smaller dots in the background or make fewer of them. It's totally up to you. Oh, that one came out big. Totally up to you. Just making a smattering of flowers all over the landscape. And you can group them together or make them far apart. I usually think about when I'm doing nature, make some overlapping, some close together, some far apart, some big, some small, just trying to keep a variety in there. And if you have any funny brush strokes, this is your opportunity to cover over those weird shapes and hide them. That's another way of adjusting my previous layer. I had some gaps and things. That's where I'm going to put flowers. Nobody will ever know. It'll be my little secret. And I'm going all the way down to the bottom with these flowers. In this sample, they're more visible in the center here, but we want to make sure they're all over left and right too. You can see they show through our pine trees. And I'm using my little skinny brush to dot those on there, and that is white mixed with yellow to start. But you don't have to limit yourself in colors here. This is also where you can use your creativity and make any kind of flowers you like. I have red paint, so I was going to switch that next. We can either mix up an orange or do a pink. It's up to you. I'm going to mix a little bit of white with my red, so it'll be, I guess, closer to pink, but this is half and half, red and white, so I would say it's still on the red side. If you want it to be real pink, clean off the brush really well, and then start with white. I always start mixing with the lighter color because the dark one just takes over immediately. So you would want to start by starting with white and adding the darker color into it when you mix. And I'm going to add in some red flowers that overlap some of those yellow ones and some that go in between. Just try to prevent making a regular pattern whenever you're making things in nature, because it'll keep it natural if you make some close together, some far apart, some big, some small, some overlapping each other, and some separate. Want to keep it random, and I'm trying to keep the numbers random as well. So I'm making like 10 together or 2 together and 5 and just totally random numbers of flowers. And you can make that illusion go all the way around the edge. I'll show you. I like to make that canvas wrap all the way around with my shapes. So I do that edge too. Oh, and I forgot to do the bottom. I better paint that bottom edge that was leaning on the easel green. We'll have to remember to do that before we go on to our trees. Dotting those on with the tip of the bristle of the small brush. I like that. And you could add purple, blue columbines or any colors you like. I think, yeah, there might be some blue flowers in there. So I can go with my dark blue and add some of those dots as well. I'm gonna add some of those lower down on my canvas here. I think I'm gonna just keep the darker ones on the more towards the bottom and just a few. And when I say towards the bottom, I want to make the occasional one a little bit higher up, but just one or two. Most of those will be grouped towards the bottom. If you make one unexpected one out of the regular set, that's that uneven, natural look that I'm going for. That's why we make some wildly out of place. I'm gonna make sure I don't forget that left edge. See, I gotta go back with my green and finish those edges on my canvas because I didn't see that far edge. I'm gonna make sure I am making that canvas wrap complete because that'll look pretty when I hang it up and everybody can see it hanging up in my house. So we have all of our sipping and paintings hanging up my stairwell. And when you go up the steps, you want to make sure you finish that bottom edge because you can see that when you walk up the steps. So I make sure you pick it up off the easel if you're working on an easel. And do that bottom edge as well. Maybe you're working flat though. You don't have that issue. There we go. Finishing that whole bottom edge. There, that's what that looks like. Lifting that up. So I've got yellow flowers and pink, red flowers and dark blue flowers. Make sure you do step back from your work. Keep in mind that the artist always sits about 1.5 feet from the painting, but the viewer is many feet back, enjoying your painting, hopefully with a drink on your couch, and they're seeing the whole thing at once. So you want to make sure you get back and look at the work, taking the whole thing in, and then your eye moves across the canvas so you can see the whole composition as it comes together, because you want to experience it like the viewer, and that will let you judge if you need to make any adjustments in the way it appears. So here, I'm looking to see if I've got my flowers spread out in a way that is pleasing to me before I say that I'm done with them. I want to make sure I randomize them. So I'm putting a few more yellow in here, and some of them dried a little clearer, so I'm going to go over some ones that I made that are too see-through. There we go, happy little flowers. And then we can let that dry just a bit. Take a sip of my water here. Oh, and let's see. We'll do a toast if you're celebrating anything. How about to the holidays? All 365 of them. Lately, one day kind of blends into another, so why shouldn't it all be a holiday? I call this Holiday Monday. All right. And So now we have a whole foreground of pine trees. We kind of have a pine forest that's closest to us in this composition, in this mountain splendor. And it gives us an opportunity to learn how to do those happy little pine trees that Bob Ross taught us all how to do. And I'm going to use my big brush for that. You can use a fan brush if you have that at your disposal. I have this stiff haired bristle fan brush, but that is not entirely necessary. You can either use your big brush or your medium-sized brush. Let's do the medium. Let's start with the medium because that'll be, I think, the easiest one to use. I got that out of the water jar and I'm wiping it off on the paper towel to get all the water off the handle as well as the bristles. And you can try this out on a piece of paper, this pine tree technique, if you have not tried it before, because it has a little bit of a learning curve. But let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to use that medium-sized brush, and mine is cut straight across. I don't know if you can see it, a little flat brush, and I'll hold that up in front of my black here. So you can see that's a little straight half-inch brush. And I'm going to use dark green paint. You can mix a little bit of black with your green. You could totally do these, you could totally do them black, which would make it really dark, but these are dark green in this sample. So I'm going to use dark green paint, and I'm just dipping the tips of the bristles of that medium-sized brush in, so you can see it's just the tip of the brush covered in a little bit of paint. And then I'm going to hold that brush on end and go straight up and down, tapping a tree trunk. You could paint a straight tree trunk too, but I'm just going to tap, 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 going straight up, making a tree trunk. And I am going above the horizon line of my meadow, but I'm keeping them beneath the horizon of the mountains. So it's the tips of the trees are going to come somewhere in the middle of my mountain range. So first I use the tips of the bristles, went straight up, holding the brush on end and tap, tap, tapping a tree trunk up the middle. Just to show you what that looks like. You could also just paint a straight line straight up, but I'm using that technique because we're going to need it right now. We're kind of practicing the technique because we're going to need it to make the pine needles. So continuing with that sort of brush stroke, I'm going to leave the very tippy top of the tree pointed up, and just beneath that, I'm holding the brush flat straight across. I'm going to go across that with a little little mustache just beneath that tippy top. You can see what that looks like, just a little dash straight across using the tips of the bristles to get that started. And then as I move down the tree, I'm going to zigzag back and forth across the tree. And every time I go left and right, I'm getting further and further from that tree trunk as I go back and forth. So let me show you what that looks like as I get it started. I'm holding the brush on end, and I'm tap, tap, tapping across left and right, and I'm getting further and further from that tree trunk as I go back and forth. Because we want the whole shape of the pine tree, of course, to be a very elongated triangle. So the boughs get longer and longer as they go further and further down. So let me show you, let me make some branches going back and forth. I'm doing these kind of fast just to show you that they're going to get longer and longer as they go down. And it's okay if you go off the edge of the canvas. I did start with my tree on the furthest right with this little demonstration. So the boughs on the right are going right off the edge of the canvas, and that's okay. And I am going to go all the way down to the bottom edge of the canvas too. And my longest branches are going to be at the very bottom there. And right now I'm tapping the brush, so I'm getting these little stipple or dash shapes going back and forth. And I just want to get a general like zigzaggy shape going with these branches. It doesn't have to be an actual connected zigzag, just going back and forth, left and right. Hold that up so you can see it close. So right now you can see it looks kind of like a very empty tree there. But we want to make sure that we cover the center tree trunk with texture. So I'm going to go back and forth particularly over the center, and hide that tree trunk so that it's more filled in the middle. I do want to leave my branches left and right kind of open and leave room for the birds to fly through on the edges, but I want to hide that tree trunk pretty well. You don't have to totally fill it in. There can be a gap here and there, but I want to hide the center trunk mostly because I want it to be denser in the center, because you have to imagine that some of those branches in the real world are coming towards you. It's a three-dimensional cone shape, so that's why it's more filled in the middle. But we want to leave room on the edges for the birds to fly through. So that's what it looks like when I've hidden that tree trunk more in the center. You can see those little tips of the branches are showing on the outsides, and the birds can fly through back and forth. But in the middle, it's more filled in over the tree trunk, so it's hidden, that center trunk. And I'm tapping that back and forth with this medium-sized brush. I just want to make sure that the very tippy top, I'm turning the brush vertically and holding it straight up because I want a point at the very top. You know, where the angel sits on the Christmas tree, we want that point at the very top to point up on those pine trees. And I was going straight across, holding the brush horizontal with those brush strokes. Sometimes I see people tip the brush left or right, or, you know, facing down. That is a look. You can have a different variety of tree. Maybe your branches, your boughs are more slopey. That's okay too, but I tend to make mine more straight across. That is my go-to tree, just as long as the boughs at the bottom are the longest. And I do want to go all the way down to the bottom edge, and I'm going to continue that right over the very bottom that was resting on the easel too, and around. I continue that texture around that gallery wrap too. That's what that looks like, bottom edge, so that they're all finished. And I've got my one tree on the right here. Now I do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trees in my composition, and they do go above the horizon line of meadow, but beneath the horizon of the mountain. So I'm going to make them different heights, but they're all going to kind of hit that center somewhere. So keep that in mind as you make your different height trunks for those trees. I think I'm going to make the tallest one here on the left, the trunk really close to the left edge. So that's about 1 inch from the left-hand side of the canvas, and pretty high up, even overlapping the shadow part of my mountain. Using the medium-sized brush, tapping up that center trunk, and then going beneath that, holding it horizontally, the little short branches at the very top, and then going back and forth with longer branches as I move down that tree trunk. And I like to use that medium-sized brush also because as you make that brush stroke on end there, kind of smashing the tips of the bristles against the canvas, it gives you a little kind of texture and gives you a sense of those pine needles. That's what's nice about using the brush in that way, kind of smashing it on end. And I'm gonna go back up the middle and hide that tree trunk with the darker green on my trees. And you can mix a little bit of black with your green, but here again, when you start mixing the color, start with the lighter color and then add in a little bit of black, because you'll find that the black will take over and it'll be too dark if you're not careful. So just add a little bit of black at a time when you mix. Always start with the lighter and add the darker a little bit at a time. And do remember to keep those branches open on the end. A trick that illustrators use when they paint trees also is that not all of the brush strokes have to be actually connected to the tree. When you make leaves, you can see some of these are floaters and they just float kind of next to where the branch would be, and that gives it a visually opened up look. Let those birds fly through, and it'll just letting them fly near your mind will kind of visually connect it, because you know in your head, oh yeah, leaves connected to trees. But if it's open on the painting, it's a little bit of an illusion, and it opens it up visually. So just keep that in mind. So it's okay if some of them are just floaters and they're just nearby. I'll make a few more so you can see that, where they're generally where those boughs would be, but they're not all connected by a branch because it doesn't need to be, and it opens it up for me. And then you can see the meadow through the background. That's nice. And we don't have to fill in. When I say we fill in the center, you can leave the occasional open space there to let the meadow show through, as long as it's mostly filled in the center. Then you'll get the sense of that three-dimensional cone shape of the tree. But it opens it up, and it makes it look a little bit like you're seeing the light show through that tree too. So now I have two taller trees left and right, and I'm going to make some shorter ones towards the middle. And it's okay if these overlap each other too. So you can keep that in mind. But I'm making my tree trunk again. And this one's going to be a shorter tree. Going back and forth, tap, tap, tap. Let me just show you what that looks like if you do have a fan brush on hand. I don't know which different supplies you have. I'm going to wet that brush off and wipe it on the paper towel to start it. But using a fan brush, you can hold that horizontally and go straight across too. The nice thing about this brush is it has really stiff bristles, and you get a really pronounced texture. It's even more of a texture than you get from the nylon brushes. So that's why it's kind of fun if you have those on hand. This is called, I think, boar's hair bristle. So you can try that out if you have one of those available to you. The one thing to keep in mind if you do have a fan brush, especially if you have a nylon hairbrush, is you just want to keep your touch light, because if you press hard, you'll get a little bit of an arc shape. It'll pick up the texture of the brush. It'll make a little bit of an arc shape on your canvas, and it kind of makes it look like you painted it with a brush. If you use a light touch, you'll just get the texture out of the brush. So I load the tips of the bristles up with paint. So you want a lot of paint, but a light touch. And that's how I get that texture. And you always start with less. Less is better, and then you can always add more. That's why we start light. And we can always go darker. But same technique, just filling in the centers more. And you can also tip the brush if you have a brush that's long across like that. You tip it diagonally up and down a little bit, and you can get a little bit of a variety here. If all your brush strokes are exactly straight across, you'll notice a regular pattern, and that might be distracting because we want to keep this looking natural. So that's, some of them are tipped up a little bit, some tipped down. You can see there's a little variety to that shape. And we have a little shorter pine tree. But let me go back to that medium-sized brush and do the other ones in case you don't have that fan brush handy. There's always more than one way to do this. I'm going to add another tree that's a little bit, let's make this one a little bit taller and kind of close together with my left hand group on that side, and then back and forth, tap, 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 tap. Loading up the tips of the bristles with the dark green paint and using a light touch back and forth. Starting with that zigzag pattern. And once I have the elongated triangular shape with the longer boughs at the bottom, I'm going to fill in over that tree trunk in the middle, hiding it, tap, tap, tapping back and forth so that you can't see my tree trunk. Get my little pine tree going, and then making those little branches, twisting my hand around a little bit up and down to give a variety to the brushstroke, and leaving some of those pine needles just flying off, not even connected, just kind of next to those branches to give that tree that open look. And keep in mind also that although the branches get bigger as they go to the bottom, we don't want to make it like formulaic. So sometimes I make one branch stick out a little bit longer to break up any regular pattern as well. They don't have to be perfectly groomed trees, because this is not suburbia, this is the mountains, so nobody's trimming them perfectly. Some of those branches can be longer here and there. Even though we know it's generally a triangular shape, sometimes you can poke one out here and there. And make some close together, some of the branches in height close together and some farther apart, so that's not a perfect pattern either. You can always step back and take a look at them and see if you have anything that looks uncomfortably regular, and then that's where you add in a little bit of variety, make some close together if they're too regular in distance. So I have two trees here that are closer together and one that's more distant from this grouping, and then one on the right, and I think I'll add one more tree kind of 2/3 the way across this canvas. Just one more. I'm keeping it an odd number of trees. I always like to work with odd numbers. I think it adds to the unbalanced look when I paint. That's my personal thing that I look for. I just use darker green paint for these trees, and I'm looking at these, and this is called phthalo green, this dark green, and it's kind of a very regular looking color to me, like it's going on kind of evenly, and I could break up that pattern by adding a little bit of dark blue in here and there. I don't have any black on my plate. I didn't put that out. You could add a little bit of black too if you prefer that. I have this weird aversion to black paint because it really stands out on a lot of my compositions. So I stay away from it myself because I don't want to overdo it, but maybe you have a lighter touch and you're able to use it more effectively. But for this, I didn't even put it out, so I'm going to just add a touch of blue here and there, just to break up the evenness of that phthalo green. I don't want to make it look like paint. I actually, I want to keep it looking like nature. So by adding just a touch of the dark blue here and there, and I didn't clean the brush, I'm just dipping it in the dark blue paint. I'm going to add just a few brush strokes over the center of that tree, zigzagging back and forth, just touching it here and there. Not any sort of regular pattern. I added just a little grouping there at the top, and then maybe a dot dot here and there, and then at the bottom another little grouping. And that breaks up that I used phthalo blue over phthalo green to give that a little variety. So that's an option for you. You could also mix paint, if you don't want to just add it directly to the canvas, mix it up into a darker green on the plate and use that technique as well if you want to add a little bit of depth and variety. I'm doing it the quick and easy way, just adding the dot here and there where it's darker, and very randomly, not any kind of regular pattern. I just want to give a sense of shadow here and there on my trees. So think of it as adding a little bit of shadow underneath the boughs here and there, but just a very little touch of it if you're going to add that. And I like the idea of doing a little bit of dark blue because we use that in the mountains. And by adding a little bit of blue in the trees in the foreground, it helps your eye skip around over that composition. As an artist, I like to spread a little bit of color evenly over the canvas. And that kind of makes your eye move around the whole composition. And I want to make sure I do that underneath part. I want to continue that illusion down there. So when I hang these up, I got my gallery wrap all done. So I'm dotting those boughs right over the bottom edge of that canvas too. And I bet I forgot the left-hand side. Let's go look. Yep. Gotta do that left-hand side. I am wearing gloves because this is how I get all painty. It's okay if you're not. You can see I always pick them up and get messy. You don't have to wear gloves when you're working, but the acrylic will wash off with warm water and soap. So if you're not as messy as I am, you can do that. But I get all painty, so I wear gloves. Get on your hands, and now I have to fix what I painted over because I'm all messy up here. I did say I left those brushes in the water jar earlier, but I didn't tell you anything about cleaning the brushes. You do always want to make sure you take care of your materials, and we're just about done here. So let me just say, make sure you take a little bit of liquid soap or regular soap in the palm of your hand and take these brushes out of the water jar, mix the soap around on the tips of the bristles, or just mix them around on the palm of your hand with soap and water, and then rinse them until the water runs clear of soap, and leave them, flatten out the brushes if they're flats, and leave them horizontally on the sink to dry. And then you'll take care of your materials. You always want to make sure you're nice to your brushes, and then you'll have them your whole life. I inherited some of my grandfather's brushes because he was so good to them. He taught me to clean them. So you always want to make sure you're nice to your materials. And do make sure that you sign your work. If you have a paint pen handy, that can be helpful. Now I'm finger painting. I saw some dots there, and I'm spreading out with my finger. That's also how you get painting. You can use your fingers if you want a particular texture, so you can play with the paint that way. But when you decide that you're done, you make sure you step back from your painting and it looks exactly the way you want it to. Then you can sign your brush, or sign your painting with a little skinny brush, or use a paint pen to do this. I always put my initials in the corner so that everybody knows who did the work of art. I'm just going to use a light color and put my initials down there. And then you can come and get this at Sipping and Painting Hampton. We'll have it on the sale table, and you can own an original. So I want to make sure you sign that work of art, and then everybody will know who did. But I'm going to leave that up for just a few minutes, and we also have the sample on our other Zoom window, so you can have that for inspiration. And I want to make sure I thank you for joining me for virtual Sipping and Painting Hampton tonight. Let me see if you want to hold up your painting. I want to see what you did. Do you want to show me? We can take a picture together. Sabrina can take a little Zoom picture. Oh, look at that. Look how great that looks. You got to get, hold that whole thing up so we can, did I fit this in the window? I'm going to tip it in the right direction. There we go. One more. There we go. And then we can post that Zoom picture as well. Very nice. Beautiful. And make sure you check this out on our YouTube channel if you want to spend more time painting and hanging around with me as well. And also, we're going to be doing other Zoom classes. Check our upcoming schedule online, and you can join us and do another Zoom class as well. But thank you for joining me on virtual Sipping and Painting Hampton.